What if a kiss in front of 100 flashing cameras wasn't love, but a lie? What if that one moment meant to hurt someone else? Accidentally opened the door to healing. Graham Whitaker was a millionaire CEO, a man praised for building sustainable empires, but still unable to rebuild the life he lost when his wife died. Charlotte Hayes was just his assistant, recently divorced, soft-spoken, rebuilding her world piece by piece. They weren't lovers. They weren't even close. But in a crowded ribbon-cutting ceremony, with champagne in one hand and the weight of the past in the other, Graham kissed her. And just like that, their lives changed. What was meant as a performance suddenly became personal. Shame, silence, and pride spiraled into something neither of them expected a second chance, neither of them asked for, but both desperately needed. Was she just a convenient cover? Was he just another man avoiding grief by using affection? Or was this the beginning of something real? Hit like, share this story with someone who believes in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you look at love and mistakes forever. She never saw it coming. In front of 100 guests, cameras flashing, and champagne bubbling into flutes, he kissed her. Charlotte Hayes had spent all afternoon making sure the event would unfold like clockwork. She had double-checked the catering, smoothed the creases on the program pamphlets, and tested the mic for Graham 3 times. Every detail had been accounted for, down to the seasonal wildflowers in the vases, warm ochres and burnt oranges to match the early October light that spilled through the courtyard. The new Blue Ridge Arts Center was finally open, a symbol of innovation wrapped in rustic charm. Charlotte had coordinated the whole thing over months of quiet, efficient work. She wasn't the type to stand in front of the crowd. Her place was behind the scenes, clipboard in hand, hair pinned neatly, voice calm and composed. That night was no different until it was. She stood just off to the side as Graham, always poised and measured, delivered his remarks with steady confidence. His words rolled out smoothly, thanking donors, acknowledging artists, weaving in anecdotes about sustainable design and local impact. The audience leaned in, smiling, nodding. Charlotte barely heard a word. She was already calculating the timing for the next cue, ready to slip him his closing card. When she stepped forward to hand it to him, their eyes met briefly, plainly, and then it happened. Without warning, Graham leaned in and kissed her, not a peck on the cheek, not a friendly gesture misread, but a real kiss, short, intentional, and completely out of place. Her breath caught in her throat. A flicker of laughter rippled through the crowd, followed by claps, a few gasps, and the unmistakable flurry of camera shutters. Charlotte's entire body stiffened. Her hands froze mid-gesture, her feet rooted to the brick-paved ground. For a second, the world blurred. She didn't respond. Couldn't. Her arms stayed by her sides, her eyes open. She wasn't in the kiss. She was in shock. When Graham pulled back, his expression was unreadable, cool, confident. He turned back to the crowd with that familiar half-smile he wore when closing deals, the kind that said, "Everything is under control," but everything wasn't. Charlotte felt the heat rise in her cheeks, and her heart thudded hard in her chest. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was this some PR stunt? A moment of spontaneity gone wrong? A misguided gesture? And then she saw her, Melissa Carter, standing near the edge of the patio, wineglass in hand, eyes sharp as glass. Melissa, in her tailored navy blazer and signature red lipstick. Melissa, Graham's ex-girlfriend and the current face of a powerful investment firm. The same woman who had once turned her back on Graham during his lowest point and now seemed eager to return as he reached new heights. Charlotte's gut clenched. She didn't need anyone to explain it. The kiss wasn't about affection. It wasn't about her at all. And then, as if to confirm what her body already knew, Graham leaned in again this time, not for another kiss, but to whisper quietly near her ear, "Just play along. Just play along." 4 words that cut deeper than the kiss ever could. Her heart dropped. What little stability she'd clung to, the professionalism, the boundaries, the pride she'd rebuilt after her divorce, all felt suddenly compromised. She wasn't a person in that moment. She was a pawn, a placeholder in someone else's game. But she smiled, because that's what Charlotte did. She smiled through awkward silences, through gritted teeth, through humiliation and heartbreak. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and gently stepped back, leaving Graham to soak up the last waves of applause alone. Charlotte moved toward the refreshment table, weaving carefully through clusters of guests and murmured chatter. Every glance felt amplified. She imagined whispers behind manicured hands. Imagined Melissa's eyes still locked on her, dissecting her from across the courtyard. At the champagne table, she reached for a flute and took a long sip, though the bubbles caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the glass back down. She took a deep breath. She'd been here before, figuratively, if not literally, years ago, in the final months of her crumbling marriage. She had stood in a crowded room and realized she was invisible to the one person who was supposed to see her. That night, as her then-husband laughed too long at another woman's joke, Charlotte had felt that same hollowness bloom in her chest. This was worse, because this time she had been seen, but not for who she was, only for the image she could project. She looked down at her reflection in the polished surface of the champagne bucket. Her lipstick was still perfect, her dress flawless, but something behind her eyes was different now. Not broken, just pulled back. She straightened her shoulders and turned away from the crowd. Graham was still smiling, still conversing with guests, shaking hands, posing for photos. Not once did he glance her way. She didn't expect him to. Not anymore. Quietly. She made her way past the floral arch at the entrance and into the dimming evening air. The chill met her skin like a balm. Autumn in Asheville always carried a certain melancholy, leaves surrendering their brilliance before the fall, the sky turning softer, darker. Charlotte walked the block to her car, heels clicking softly on the sidewalk. She didn't rush, didn't cry, but inside, something small was unraveling. Not because she'd been kissed, but because she hadn't been chosen. Not really. She closed the car door, set her clutch down, and exhaled. Her hands finally stopped shaking. She stared at the steering wheel for a moment, then pulled out into the dusky streets, the city lights blurring in her peripheral vision. This wasn't over. Not in the way she needed it to be. She brewed his coffee every morning, but today, her hands trembled too much to hold the mug steady. The office was quiet, as it always was at 7:15 a.m. A sliver of sunlight filtered through the wide windows of Whitaker Group's top floor, casting golden light across the brushed oak floors and minimalist decor. The building smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon. Someone must have lit a seasonal candle near reception. Charlotte moved like she always did, measured, efficient, invisible. Her soft beige heels made no sound as she crossed the executive kitchen, filling the carafe, scooping the beans, wiping the counter with the corner of a napkin. Routine steadied her, but not this morning. Her fingers trembled when she reached for the creamer. She gripped the handle tighter, willing herself back into control. The cup rattled gently against the saucer as she carried it into Graham's office and placed it just so on the walnut desk. 2 inches from the keyboard, handle turned to the right. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. He was sitting there, as he always was. Shirt pressed, tie subtle, laptop open, phone screen aglow with unread messages. The only sign that anything had changed was in the way he didn't look up. Nothing in his demeanor hinted at what had happened the night before. No acknowledgement, no flicker of discomfort. It was as if the kiss, the whisper, the humiliation, all of it had been erased with the sunset. Charlotte stood for a moment longer than necessary, the silence between them stretching too thin. He cleared his throat. "Thank you. Charlotte." His voice was even, too even. She nodded once and turned to leave, back at her desk. She sat down carefully. Her back straightened instinctively. a habit from years of teaching before her life unraveled, and she traded lesson plans for schedules and parent-teacher nights for gala receptions. She opened her email, 42 unread messages. Most of them carried subject lines like CEO's new flame or romance on the Blue Ridge Whittaker's surprise kiss. One even had the gall to ask if she and Graham would be giving an exclusive interview. Her cheeks burned. She closed the tab. But the heat didn't fade. Last night kept playing in her mind like a broken record. The feel of his hand on her back, the way his body angled just enough to make it seem real, and the quiet betrayal wrapped in 4 little words. Just play along. No apology, no warning, no afterthought, just assumption. He had assumed she'd be fine with it, that she'd play the part, smile, fade into the background again after serving her purpose. After all, she had always done what was asked of her, always been reliable, always invisible. And maybe that was her fault, too. Charlotte swallowed hard and clicked open a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had come to Asheville 3 years ago with nothing but a used SUV, a cardboard box of books, and a scarred heart she didn't talk about. Her marriage had ended quietly, too quietly, like a candle running out of wax. No screaming, no affairs, just absence. His and hers. 2 people living parallel lives until one of them finally said, "I think we're done." She'd left her teaching job the same week. Too many curious eyes, too much pity from parents who whispered her name differently now. Charlotte Hayes, divorced, Charlotte Hayes, alone. The job at Whittaker Group was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay the bills while she figured out what came next. But months had turned into years. The steadiness soothed her. She had grown into the rhythm of it, and she had been good at it. Too good, maybe. Now, all of it felt fragile again. The blank document on her screen slowly began to fill. "Dear Mr. Whittaker," she typed, "effective 2 weeks from today, I hereby submit my resignation." She paused. Her eyes lingered on the blinking cursor. Her heart beat too loudly in the stillness of the room. Could she really do it? Walk away after all the work, the trust, the space she had carefully carved for herself in a life that had once felt like nothing but broken glass? She reread the first line. Something about it felt too clean, too final, too much like running. Her mind drifted back to the conference room from earlier that morning, how Graham had entered with a stack of folders and never once looked in her direction. How he had addressed the team without his usual calm confidence, but never faltered. How he had avoided her eyes, not out of shame, but out of something worse, detachment. He wasn't just using her. He was pretending like it hadn't even happened, and that, more than anything, scraped against something raw inside her. Charlotte reached for the mouse and moved the draft into her personal folder. Not deleted, not sent, just saved, for now. She sat back in her chair and looked out the window. The trees below were just beginning to change, their tips kissed with amber and rust. Asheville always did autumn beautifully, the season of letting go. But Charlotte wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Her pride was bruised, yes, her trust shaken. But she hadn't fought her way out of the wreckage of a failed marriage and a shattered identity just to slink away at the first sting of humiliation. No, if she left, it would be on her terms, not his, not anyone's. She glanced again at Graham's office, the door still shut. Let him drink his coffee. Let him enjoy the silence he seemed to prefer. But soon enough, he'd have to deal with what silence leaves behind. No one wants to be a placeholder, not in love, not in life. Charlotte moved through the corridors of Whittaker Group like a ghost in her own life. People didn't stop talking when she entered a room, but their tone shifted. Jokes came with longer pauses. Eye contact shortened, and smiles grew thinner. She felt it everywhere in the way someone tilted a chin toward her as they whispered behind a steaming coffee cup, and how interns stared a beat too long before looking away. It wasn't just the kiss anymore. It was the story that had bloomed from it. CEO finds love again after tragedy. The quiet assistant at the center of it all, from shadows to spotlight. Who is Charlotte Hayes? She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't done anything but stand still at the wrong time. And now she was being noticed for all the wrong reasons. That morning, she passed a group of junior analysts in the break room. Their laughter dropped when they saw her, and one woman's gaze lingered with something between curiosity and pity. Charlotte walked past, spine straight. She didn't break pace, but her fingers clenched around the folder she was carrying, nails pressing crescent moons into the leather. By the time she reached her desk, her mind had already started its spiral. Too convenient, her ex-husband had once told her. Too easy to predict, too safe to fall for. It had been a casual comment, delivered over a half-washed dish in their suburban kitchen, but it had stuck like a thorn in her chest ever since. Back then, she thought it was just frustration, maybe boredom, maybe the natural withering of love. Now, she wasn't so sure. Was that how people saw her? Safe, predictable, convenient, someone you kiss to make another woman jealous, someone you promote to smooth things over, someone who would never say no. That afternoon, Graham knocked gently on her doorframe. His smile was careful. "I've added a raise to your upcoming contract review," he said, voice even. "Also, I'd like you to oversee the downtown redevelopment proposals directly. You've earned more than just executive admin work." It was supposed to sound like progress, like trust, like respect. But to Charlotte, it felt like a bribe, like hush money wrapped in opportunity, like compensation instead of apology. She gave him a tight smile and nodded once. He lingered, as if waiting for something, a thank you. Maybe a softening, a sign that things were returning to how they'd been, but they weren't. They couldn't. That evening, Charlotte received an invitation email from Melissa's assistant dinner meeting at the Fennel Room. 7:30 will be me. Mr. Whitaker would like you to attend. She read it twice. Then she clicked decline, no explanation, no excuse, just no. It was the smallest rebellion, but it was hers. At 7:28 p.m., she was still in the office, organizing notes from a zoning proposal. She worked slowly, deliberately, letting each paper slide into its proper place. She didn't look at the clock again. She didn't wonder whether Graham noticed her absence. She hoped he did. And yet, the worst blow didn't come from him. It came the next morning. Melissa found her in the East Wing copy room, alone. She leaned against the doorway with the kind of polished ease that came from expensive tailoring and years of having the last word. Her perfume was sharp, wintry, a contrast to Charlotte's faint lavender scent. "I have to hand it to you," Melissa said, voice light. "You've kept remarkably quiet. That's admirable. Not everyone knows how to stay in their lane." Charlotte didn't respond. She continued gathering the copies, pressing them into the manila folder in her arms. Her heartbeat picked up, but her expression stayed still. Melissa stepped forward, her heels tapping with quiet menace. "You seem like the kind of woman who knows her place, who understands that some stories are meant to be background noise, not headlines." Still, Charlotte said nothing. Melissa smiled, cool and satisfied. A good supporting role can be just as important as the lead, as long as you don't forget which is which. Then she turned and walked away. The door closed behind her with an almost gentle click. Charlotte stood there for several moments, staring at the blank wall across from her. Her fingers dug into the folder so tightly that the edges bent beneath her grip. The silence in the room roared. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stood there, shoulders rigid, breath shallow, her pride bleeding slowly beneath her skin. Later that afternoon, she found herself wandering toward the back of the building, past the glass offices, past the second-floor conference rooms, and out through the double doors that led to the lake behind Whitaker Group's main wing. The water shimmered in the late autumn sun. Leaves floated across the surface like slow-moving thoughts. Ducks nested near the edges, and wind carried the scent of wet bark and cool air. Charlotte stood there for a long while. She took off her heels and let her toes touch the cold stone edge of the dock. Her reflection stared back at her, neatly dressed, composed, unremarkable. "Who am I doing this for?" she whispered to no one. Not for Graham, not for Melissa, not for the job. And yet, she stayed. She stayed in a story she hadn't written, playing a part she didn't audition for. Her silence had always been her strength, but now it felt like a cage. A woman made of silence, convenient, predictable, replaceable. Charlotte closed her eyes and let the breeze lift her hair. For once, she didn't try to fix anything. She didn't reach for control. She just existed. There would come a time to speak, but not yet. For now, she would let the questions sit and let the water answer them in its own time. The coffee was warm, her hands were steady again, but her heart had never been colder. Charlotte placed the mug beside Graham's desk at precisely 7:42 a.m., just like she did every morning. Same blend, same cream to coffee ratio, same ceramic cup with the tiny chip at the base, an imperfection no one else noticed but her. She didn't linger. She hadn't in over a week. Graham mumbled a quiet thanks without looking up. His fingers tapped across the keyboard with mechanical rhythm, but his eyes paused for a fraction longer than they used to, just enough for her to feel it. It had been 7 days since the kiss. 7 days since the press whispered, since Melissa's words sliced, since Charlotte stared at her reflection in the lake and wondered who she'd become. And in those 7 days, she had been impeccable. She'd met every deadline, organized every folder, drafted every executive brief with surgical precision. Her work was beyond reproach, and her demeanor, frostbitten in its composure, polite, professional, unshakable. She responded when Graham spoke to her, of course, but never more than necessary. Yes. I've scheduled the meeting. No. Nothing urgent on your calendar. I'll have the report ready by end of day. He tried small talk once or twice. Comments about the weather, about a book he'd read. She answered with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. He stopped trying. But what he didn't know was that every time she caught a glimpse of him, an unexpected glance in the hallway, a reflection in the glass door, her chest tightened, not with longing, not even with anger, with disbelief. Disbelief that someone so meticulous, so measured, had made such a reckless choice, that he'd kissed her in front of the world, whispered, "Just play along like it was a kindness," and then moved on like it had never happened. Some wounds didn't bleed. They just sat beneath the skin, cold and silent. By Thursday, Charlotte had started taking her lunch breaks alone. She used to eat in the conference lounge with 2 other admins, laughing over leftover casseroles and stories about bad Tinder dates. But now, she preferred the booth in the cafe across the street. Quiet. Window side. A notebook open beside her salad. That afternoon, she wasn't sketching ideas or making lists like usual. She was writing a transfer request. The words came slowly. Each sentence felt like shedding something invisible. She didn't want to leave the company, not really. But she also couldn't stay here. Not in this building. Not with Graham 2 doors down. Not with whispers in the halls and Melissa's perfume still lingering in the elevator some mornings. Savannah was a small branch, quieter, coastal. She could breathe there. She looked down at the half-written request. To whom it may concern, her pen paused. How do you explain that you're leaving not because of failure, but because of quiet betrayal? She didn't finish the letter that day. And maybe she wouldn't have tried again so soon, if not for what happened that evening. Charlotte had just stepped into the lobby after a late meeting. The sun was beginning to set, casting amber streaks across the marble floor. Most of the staff had already left, but a child's voice echoed from the direction of the reception area. When she turned, she saw a small figure swinging her legs from one of the chairs. Emily, Graham's daughter. Her hair was pulled into a crooked ponytail, and she wore a backpack that was almost too big for her small frame. There was a book in her lap, open to a page with painted rabbits. Emily looked up and smiled, not politely, Not cautiously, genuinely. "Hi, Miss Charlotte," she said, like they'd just seen each other yesterday. "Are you coming to dinner with us again?" The question hit harder than it should have. Charlotte's throat tightened. She remembered that one evening, months ago, when Graham had invited her to help plan a fundraiser from home. Emily had insisted she stay for pasta, then showed her a collection of pressed leaves from the trees in their yard. They had laughed about one that looked like a moose. Emily had asked if Charlotte had kids of her own. She had simply said no. Now? Standing in the golden light of the lobby, Charlotte didn't know what to say. "I don't think so." "Sweetheart," she said softly. Emily tilted her head. "But you're nice. And you made Dad laugh. He doesn't do that much." Charlotte smiled just barely. Before she could respond, Graham's voice called from down the hall. "Emily! We're going!" The girl hopped off the chair and waved at Charlotte. "Bye. Maybe next time." Then she ran off, backpack bouncing. Charlotte stood still for a moment longer. That evening, at home. She turned on the lamp in her living room and opened her laptop. The transfer request file was still open, blinking at her like a quiet dare. She read the sentences again. "I am requesting consideration for a reassignment. Effective date TBD. Reason personal." She stared at the word personal for a long time. Yes, it was personal. Too personal. Her finger hovered over the delete key. Instead, she clicked save and closed the screen. She wasn't ready. Not yet. There was still something unfinished in this story, something she hadn't named. She almost didn't go, and he almost didn't ask. But that night, something shifted. The invitation had come in the most unexpected form, handwritten, folded, and left beneath her notepad. It wasn't on company letterhead. There were no logos, no schedules, no mentions of meetings or proposals, just a simple line in Graham's familiar handwriting. "Dinner, cabin, no suits, just you and me if you're willing." Charlotte stared at it for a long time, heart ticking slowly behind her ribs. Her first instinct was to decline, politely, firmly. She didn't trust the space between them. Not yet, not fully. But something about the phrasing "if you're willing" unsettled her. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even an expectation. It was a question. One he wasn't sure she'd answer. She thought about it for 3 days. And on the 4th evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Blue Ridge skyline, she found herself driving up the winding road that led to his cabin. The trees were just beginning to lose their leaves, and the crisp air smelled of pine, earth, and a hint of smoke. The tires crunched over gravel as she pulled into the clearing. No other cars, no signs of staff, just the soft yellow glow of light spilling from the windows, and the silhouette of Graham on the porch, waiting. He wore jeans, a flannel shirt. His sleeves were rolled up. There was no trace of the CEO in his posture, no guarded expression, no polished lines rehearsed for shareholders. Just a man who looked like he hadn't slept well in weeks. Charlotte stepped out of the car slowly, her hands still on the keys a moment longer than necessary. She half expected to turn around, but she didn't. He gave a quiet nod. "You came?" She offered a small, measured smile. "I almost didn't." His lips twitched with something like understanding. "I almost didn't ask." Inside, the cabin was cozy, not extravagant, the kind of space built for quiet. A stone fireplace sat in one corner, unlit but prepared. Open shelves held mismatched dishes and jars of dried herbs. A cast iron skillet sat on the stove. The table wasn't set. There were no candles, no music, no bottle of wine already opened. He hadn't staged anything. It wasn't a performance this time. They cooked together in silence for a while. Graham chopped onions. Charlotte stirred a pot of simmering broth. Their movements fell into rhythm, accidental, unspoken, not quite familiar, but not tense either. And then, as she placed bowls on the table, Graham broke the stillness. "I brought her here once," he said, voice quiet. Charlotte didn't ask who. She already knew. "My wife loved this place," he continued, eyes not meeting hers. She said the silence made her feel clean again. Charlotte paused, the ladle hovering just above the soup. She died in winter, he said, hands folding on the edge of the table. Snowstorm hit the day before her second round of treatment. We couldn't make it to the hospital in time. A breath caught in her throat. She sat down. I didn't talk about her for a long time, he said. Didn't want to. People thought I was grieving, but really, I was hiding from feeling anything again. Charlotte watched the steam rise between them. She made me promise one thing, he said, that I wouldn't live numb. A long silence followed. Charlotte traced the edge of her bowl with her thumb, the warmth seeping into her palm. You asked me once if I ever wanted more than this job, she said softly. He looked up. I said no. But the truth is, I didn't think I deserved more. He didn't interrupt. I was married once. It ended quietly, like someone turning off the light without telling you they were leaving the room. Graham's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. I thought maybe, if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, useful enough, no one would want to leave. Her voice cracked just slightly at the edges, like ice underfoot. Graham leaned back in his chair. The kiss wasn't supposed to feel real. Charlotte looked up, but it did. He said, barely above a whisper. Something deep inside her shifted, not broken, not healed, just moved. I was trying to get back at Melissa, he added. That's the truth. But when I kissed you, I forgot she was even there. Charlotte swallowed hard, her hands wrapping tighter around her bowl. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight, he said. I just needed you to know. I see you. I should have seen you sooner. They sat in silence again, but this time, it wasn't empty. When she stood to leave, the sky had darkened. The air outside was cold and full of stars. She walked slowly to her car, gravel crunching beneath her steps. Before opening the door, she turned back. Graham was still standing on the porch, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly slouched. He looked like a man holding his breath. And then he lifted one hand just briefly and placed it over his chest, right where his heart was. Charlotte didn't wave back. But she saw it, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel cold. It was just a draft. But drafts have a way of revealing truths we don't dare speak aloud. Charlotte didn't intend to write it, not really. The words had started forming quietly in her mind one evening, as she stared at the flickering glow of her desk lamp, half listening to the wind tapping against the window. She reached for her laptop, not with purpose, but with instinct. Some part of her needed to give shape to the heaviness in her chest. She didn't title the document, didn't format it. She just typed, I don't know what hurts more, that you kissed me like I meant something, or that you pretended afterward like I didn't. Maybe it's not even about you. Maybe it's about how easy it is for the world to make a woman like me feel like a footnote in her own life. Do you know what it's like to be competent and kind and careful? And still invisible, the words came slowly at first, haltingly, like stepping into a cold lake, but soon, they poured. She wrote about the kiss, about the silence that followed, about the way Melissa's words echoed in her head late at night, like poison dripping from an old wound. About how even when she did everything right, it still wasn't enough to be seen as more than convenient. And then, she wrote about the life before all of this, about the classroom full of third graders with sticky fingers and big dreams, about bulletin boards she used to decorate by season, about the boy who gave her a drawing of a rocket ship and said, "This is you, Miss Hayes. You're going places." She hadn't thought about that in years. Charlotte paused and reread the last paragraph. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The page felt like a mirror, honest, unfiltered, unflattering. She didn't plan to print it, but something about seeing it on paper tangible, imperfect, real felt necessary. Like letting the words out would make space for something else, something lighter. So, she hit print and walked toward the copy room. But she was interrupted. A meeting reminder popped up on her screen, and before she knew it, she was halfway down the hall, pulled into back-to-back conversations. her mind moving through timelines and budgets and presentation decks. The letter forgotten on the printer tray. It was Graham who found it. He hadn't meant to pry. He was just passing by when he saw the single sheet of paper sitting unattended. No cover, no folder, just one page, face up. He recognized the font, first her preferred typeface, always clean and slightly softened, then her name, faintly marked in the corner by the system. He picked it up without thinking, and then he read the first few lines, just a handful of sentences, but enough. Enough to know he'd hurt her more deeply than she ever let show. Enough to see that her silence had never been indifference. It had been survival. His hand gripped the page tighter as he read one final line near the bottom. I don't want to be someone's useful silence anymore. He folded the paper carefully, almost reverently, and placed it back where he found it. Then he walked slowly back to his office. Inside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. The hum of the building around him seemed distant, muted by something heavier than sound. Graham sat at his desk, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. This wasn't about PR anymore, or corporate perception, or damage control. It wasn't about fixing the optics or salvaging headlines. It was about her, Charlotte. Not as an assistant, not as a loyal, competent presence in his life, but as a woman who had quietly held his chaos and was now quietly breaking under the weight of it. He leaned back and opened his bottom drawer. Inside, tucked beneath a folder of legal drafts, was an envelope he'd sealed weeks ago. His resignation, signed, ready, but never submitted. He had written it the night after the gala, the night he realized how much of himself he'd lost to autopilot, the night he kissed Charlotte and felt something shatter, not between them, but inside himself. Back then, he didn't know what it meant. Now, he did. He took the envelope out, held it for a moment, then placed it on the desk. Beside it sat a small photo frame, something Emily had gifted him after a spring picnic with Charlotte. He had almost forgotten it was there until now. In the photo, Charlotte knelt in the grass, holding a daisy crown over Emily's head. Both were laughing, their faces lit by sunlight and something even warmer. He had looked at that photo 100 times before and only seen gratitude. Now, he saw what was really there. Connection, not built on convenience, not out of necessity, but something chosen, something rare. He pressed a finger to the glass. Emily had written in pencil on the bottom of the frame, "Best day ever." Graham exhaled slowly. Maybe family didn't always look the way you planned. Maybe it wasn't built on blood or vows or carefully managed timelines. Maybe it started with small, unnoticed moments, ones you only realized mattered once they were at risk of slipping away. He looked again at the sealed envelope. Not yet. There were still things he needed to say, and this time, he wouldn't wait until it was too late to say them. Some meetings are about contracts, others about quiet ultimatums hidden behind polite smiles. It was late Thursday morning when Melissa stepped into Graham's office perfectly on time, as always. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floor like punctuation marks. She wore confidence like a tailored suit, flawless, measured, controlled. Graham stood as she entered, offering a handshake he didn't really mean. "Melissa," he said, neutral but not warm. "Graham," she replied, sitting before he invited her to. "I assume you've had time to review the revised terms." He nodded, reaching for the folder on his desk. Inside were updated documents outlining the expansion of Whitaker Group's partnership with the Caldwell Foundation, an influential investment fund Melissa had represented for over a decade. The numbers were impressive, the proposal airtight, but the room felt off, too quiet. Melissa leaned forward slightly. "The board is excited. So am I. You've built something remarkable here. Graham." He gave a small nod, eyes still on the papers. "And as someone who cares deeply about this company's future," she continued, voice light but loaded, "I think now is the right time to think long-term, not just financially, but reputationally." He glanced up. "Reputationally," he repeated, calm but clipped. Melissa smiled. "Graham, this company has survived a lot. including your grief, and it's grown stronger. But the next chapter has to be clean, strategic, uncomplicated. He said nothing. You've worked too hard to let emotions or misunderstandings interfere with something this big. His fingers drummed once on the armrest. I'm not sure I follow. Melissa tilted her head, just slightly. The gala made headlines, not for the right reasons, and while most of us know it was an impulsive moment, the public perception is fuzzier. Investors don't like fuzziness, especially when it's tied to internal relationships. There it was, the smile, the warning, the unspoken threat wrapped in executive language. He leaned back slowly. Are you implying I should fire her? Melissa gave a practiced laugh. No, of course not. That would raise more questions. But maybe a graceful repositioning, a transition to a quieter role, something less visible. Graham's jaw tightened. She's qualified. More than... Melissa nodded. No one's questioning that. But sometimes it's not about qualifications. It's about optics, about choosing between personal comfort and professional clarity. He stared at her, and in that pause, something inside him shifted, quietly, firmly. Charlotte wasn't a problem. She wasn't a variable to be managed. She was the only thing in his life that didn't feel manufactured. Before he could speak, a soft knock came at the door. Charlotte. She held a folder in her hand, unaware of what she had just walked into. I have the revised zoning reports, she said. Melissa turned toward her with a smile too sweet to be sincere. Charlotte, she said, we were just talking about you. Charlotte's gaze faltered. Graham stood. Thank you, he said gently, reaching for the folder. As Charlotte handed it over, her eyes landed on the open contract spread across the desk, the Caldwell logo in bold at the top. She'd heard enough. And more importantly, she had felt enough. She nodded politely and left the room, but something in her expression told Graham that the cost of silence was rising. That afternoon, Charlotte sat at her desk, unmoving. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just opened the folder she had been preparing for weeks, her promotion file, project summaries, client testimonials, performance reviews, all of it. She pulled it slowly from the tray, page by page. Her hands moved without hesitation, folding the documents cleanly, precisely, placing them back into the envelope they came in. Then she reached for the interoffice mail bin, but stopped. No, this wasn't paperwork. This was her line in the sand. She didn't mail the file. She walked it to HR herself and handed it to Marcy, the company's veteran administrator. I'm withdrawing this, Charlotte said, her voice calm but low. Marcy blinked. Are you sure it's already been reviewed by, I'm sure? Back at her desk, Charlotte stared out the window. She had spent so long proving she was worthy of more. Fighting to be seen not just as useful, but necessary. But if the cost of that recognition was being someone's compromise, she didn't want it anymore. By evening, the building was nearly empty. Graham sat in his office, the city lights starting to glow behind him, casting his reflection into the glass like a ghost. He opened the bottom drawer. The resignation letter still lay there, still sealed, still unsigned. But now, his hand moved toward it with more certainty. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he placed it on his desk beside the contract from Melissa and the HR memo he hadn't read yet. The room felt heavier than usual, not from pressure, from choice. Graham looked at the photograph again, Emily in mid-laugh, Charlotte holding her shoulders, both unaware the picture had even been taken. There was something in Charlotte's eyes, a softness, a quiet strength, and now, a distance he feared might become permanent. He stood and crossed the room, staring out over the city. His own reflection stared back. This was no longer a question of business. This was about the man he was willing to be, and the woman he wasn't willing to lose. He had built the company with his bare hands, but now his heart was asking him to let it go. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Graham's corner office, casting long, solemn shadows across the room. The envelope had been sitting on his desk since dawn, unsealed, the paper inside still crisp, like it was holding its breath. It was time. Graham picked it up, walked down the silent hallway, and left it without fanfare on the mahogany table of the boardroom. Just a simple letter, his resignation. The silence afterward was almost reverent. By noon, a closed-door meeting had been called. The board gathered around the same table where, for years, they had strategized acquisitions, expansion, and prestige. Today, however, the agenda had nothing to do with numbers. It was about a man choosing dignity over power. Graham sat at the head of the table, not as the CEO, but as the man who had outgrown the role. Not because it was beneath him, but because it had begun to cost him things that mattered more. "I'm grateful," he said calmly, looking each member in the eye, "for the trust, the partnership, the years we built this together. But I can't continue to lead something that no longer aligns with who I'm becoming." One of the elder board members, a silver-haired woman named Margaret who had known Graham since his first investor pitch, leaned forward. "We all go through transitions. Graham, if this is about personal matters, perhaps a sabbatical would suffice. It's not about needing time off," he said gently. "It's about choosing not to live split in half anymore." The words fell like stones into still water. Another board member, younger, finance-driven, cleared his throat. "If this is related to the situation with—" "It's not a scandal," Graham cut in, but his voice remained calm. "It's a reflection of the kind of man I want my daughter to see, of the kind of future I want to build outside quarterly earnings." They were quiet after that. And then Margaret, with eyes softened by decades of watching men cling to power, nodded slowly. "You've always been more than this title. Graham, maybe it's time we all remembered that." Downstairs, word had not officially been released, but rumors had a way of moving faster than memos. Bryn, from HR, had overheard just enough in the break room to piece it together. She didn't mean to spill it, just a passing comment to Charlotte in the hallway. "Hey, did you hear?" He submitted his resignation this morning. Board meeting's been going for hours. Charlotte froze mid-step. The world narrowed to a pulse in her ears. She managed a nod, murmured something non-committal, and walked away though every cell in her body buzzed with disbelief. He resigned. Why? Because of her. Because of Melissa. Because staying had finally become too heavy. Back at her desk, Charlotte stared blankly at her screen. She couldn't type, couldn't move. A quiet guilt unfurled inside her chest, slow and suffocating. She hadn't asked him to make that choice. She had only wanted to be treated with respect, not to become the reason someone walked away from something they had built their entire life around. But maybe it hadn't been about her at all. Maybe it had always been about him. Upstairs, after the boardroom emptied and the tension had dissolved into professional farewells, Graham returned to his office for the last time. The city outside glowed with the burnished light of early fall. People moved along sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases, unaware of the quiet revolution that had just taken place on the 12th floor. He opened his drawer, pulled out a sheet of thick ivory stationery, and uncapped a pen he hadn't used in years. Then he began to write, not to the board, not to the press, but to her, Charlotte. This isn't about damage control. It's not an apology dressed up as strategy. It's just truth. Mine. The night I kissed you, I was angry at Melissa, at myself, at how easily I let success become a cage I pretended to enjoy living in. But when I looked at you, everything stopped pretending. You were the only thing that felt real in a room full of performance. I shouldn't have pulled you into that moment, but now that I'm on the other side of it, I can't ignore what it showed me. You deserve more than crumbs of sincerity, more than backhanded compliments or quiet admiration. You deserve to be chosen, clearly, without hesitation. Without strategy, I'm not writing this to win you back. I'm writing this because it would be a mistake to leave without telling you who you are to me. You reminded me of the kind of man I promised my wife I'd keep trying to be. And for that, I'll be grateful for however long you let me be part of your story. Graham. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a plain envelope. No initials, no logo, just her name. He handed it to the receptionist with a soft instruction, "For Charlotte, no rush," and then, with a final glance at his office, Graham left the building, not as the man the world admired, but as the man he was finally learning to respect. That afternoon, Charlotte returned from a walk outside, needing fresh air more than data reports. The envelope was sitting on her desk, plain, unassuming, her name written in pen she recognized. She didn't open it, not yet. She stared at it for a long time, like it might catch fire if she touched it, because some truths are heavier when they come dressed in sincerity, and forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. But in her chest, something stirred a quiet knowing that the story was far from over. Some truths are too heavy for voices, but light enough for paper. Charlotte sat alone by the window of her small apartment, the one she had chosen for its silence, not its square footage. Outside, the trees blazed in hues of copper and wine, their branches swaying gently in the late October wind. A cup of untouched tea rested beside her on the sill, its steam now barely visible. The envelope had been sitting on her table all afternoon. She had picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. There was something terrifying about words you hadn't asked for, especially when they came from someone who had already rewritten so many of your silences. But as the light began to dim and the room was slowly claimed by the softness of evening, Charlotte unfolded the page. The handwriting was steady, familiar, measured not in control, but in care. She began to read, "Charlotte, I won't ask you to forgive me. That's not what this letter is for. This is for telling the truth I should have said a long time ago. After my wife passed, there was a kind of silence in my life that nothing could touch. Not success, not travel, not distraction. It was the kind of silence that lives under your skin. It makes everything around you sound too loud, and everything inside you feel too quiet. For years, I convinced myself that I was just managing grief, but in truth, I had let it become a shield. I stopped seeing people not because they weren't worth seeing, but because it was easier not to need anyone again. And then you walked in, not loudly, not suddenly, just steadily. You didn't try to fix anything. You didn't demand space. You just brought light where I had forgotten it could exist. I know what that kiss looked like. I know how much it must have felt like a betrayal, a manipulation. But Charlotte, you were never a substitute. You were the first real thing after a long silence. If I never get to say these words out loud, I needed you to read them at least once. You matter. You always have. Graham. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the letter on her lap. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Because it didn't try to be anything but honest. And in that honesty, something inside her that had long gone numb began to thaw. She sat there for a while, unmoving, just letting the words settle in her chest like warmth after a long winter. Tears came not in a flood, not with sobs, but quietly. The way raindrops streak a window when the storm is somewhere far away but still close enough to touch. This wasn't about being loved. It was about being seen. She had spent most of her adult life trying to make herself small enough to not be a burden, yet useful enough to be kept around. In marriages, in jobs, even in friendships, and here, in one letter, someone had finally told her, "You're not here because it's convenient. You're here because you are." She stood slowly and walked to the kitchen, placing the letter gently under a magnet on the fridge, not hidden, not tucked away, visible, because some words deserve to be looked at more than once. She poured the cold tea down the sink and made a fresh cup. The motions were grounding, soothing. Later that evening, she opened her laptop not to update her resume, not to search real estate listings in Savannah, not to revise her transfer request, but to open her calendar. She hovered over Graham's contact for a long moment, and then, with a breath, she dialed. "Hi," she said when he answered. There was surprise in his voice, but also something soft. "I got your letter," she said gently. "I read it. A pause, and he asked, "I think we should talk." She replied. Another pause. Is this one heavier? "I'd like that," he said finally. "But not about us," she added quickly. "At least not yet." He waited. "I want to talk about what happens next. Not just between us, but for me. For what I want from this company, from myself, from everything I've kept on hold." Her voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. She wasn't asking for closure. She was creating clarity. Graham said only, "Whenever you're ready." She hung up the call and placed the phone beside her tea. Outside the window, the leaves danced under a pale moonlight, spinning in quiet patterns like old truths rearranging themselves into something new. The night didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt unfinished, and that was okay. Some stories don't need a full stop, just a pause, to breathe, to become. She wasn't staying for him, she was staying for herself. The gravel crunched beneath Charlotte's boots as she stepped out of her car, the crisp air of Blue Ridge wrapping around her like a gentle reminder of change. The trees, once ablaze with fiery leaves, now stood barer, their branches stretching upward like they were ready for what came next. She clutched a folder in her hands, not filled with resumes or resignation letters, but something else, something new. The cabin looked just as she remembered, weathered but sturdy, like Graham. He opened the door before she knocked. There was no long stare, no awkward hesitation, just a simple nod and a quiet, "Hey." "Hi," she replied. Inside, the scent of cedar and black coffee hung in the air. No table set this time, no performance, just two chairs by the fireplace and enough silence between them to make room for something real. She handed him the folder. "What's this?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "My proposal," she said. "Not for us, for the company." He opened it slowly. The first page was a mission outline, a women's re-entry program, a new division within Whitaker Group focused on helping women re-enter the workforce after loss, divorce, illness, or long-term caregiving. A second chance. For others like her. Graham read each page carefully, quietly. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a small wooden clock above the mantel. She didn't rush him. After a few minutes, he looked up. "This is impressive. It's necessary," she said. "You've built buildings, Graham, beautiful ones, sustainable, strong, thoughtful. I want to build something just as lasting, but for people. For women who've been through the things no one writes into resumes." He nodded, but his eyes held a question. "And your role in this, I want to lead it," she said plainly. "Not as your assistant, not behind the scenes, but as its own department, with its own budget, team, and voice." There was no defiance in her tone, just clarity. "I'm not asking for permission," she added. "I'm offering partnership." He leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle. It took a long moment before he spoke. "I didn't expect this," he admitted, "but I see it, I see you, and I respect it." Her chest loosened just slightly. Graham set the folder down and stood, walking toward the window that looked out onto the forest. The view was quiet, humble, breathtaking. "When I stepped away from the company," he said, "I thought I was letting go of everything. But maybe this is what was supposed to come next." She joined him at the window, standing beside him, not behind. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. Finally, he turned to her. "And what about us?" Charlotte didn't look away. "That depends," she said. He waited. "If this is love," she said softly, "let's not rush it. Let's build it like everything else we've done." His throat tightened. No grand declarations, no movie-ending kisses, just truth, the kind you plant slowly, water carefully, and trust to grow. They walked back toward the front door together, before she left. Graham reached out his hand not to pull her close, but to meet her halfway. She took it, not because she was his, but because she was her own, and she had chosen to stay. Differently, better, sometimes, the youngest among us see the clearest truths. It was a quiet Monday morning when Emily arrived at Whitaker Group. her small hand tucked in Graham's much larger one. Her school had a teacher workday, and rather than leave her with a sitter, Graham had asked, "Want to come to the office with me?" Her face had lit up with that gap-toothed smile he never stopped being amazed by. Now, with her backpack bouncing and a juice box in hand, she wandered through the lobby like she owned it. The employees smiled as she passed. She was no stranger to them. Charlotte was reviewing budget revisions when a soft knock came at her office door. Before she could answer, the door creaked open, and there stood Emily. "Hi, Miss Charlotte," she said cheerfully. Charlotte's heart lifted before she even stood. "Hi there, Em," she said, rounding her desk. "What brings you here this early?" Emily didn't answer right away. She stepped in and pulled something from her backpack, a carefully folded piece of construction paper, slightly bent at the corners. "I made this," she said, handing it over with the solemnity of someone giving away something precious. Charlotte unfolded it. It was a drawing done in crayon and glitter glue. 3 stick figures, one tall with glasses, one with a yellow scarf, clearly Charlotte, and one small, wearing a pink dress. They stood in front of a brown cabin. Above them, Emily had written in wobbly letters, "Me, Daddy, and Charlotte, at our cabin." Charlotte stared at it for a moment. Something about the simplicity, the pure belief in that our cracked something open inside her. She knelt, pulling Emily gently into her arms. The child's warmth pressed against her like sunlight through the trees. "You made this for me?" she asked softly. Emily nodded. "Because you smiled the most that night." And Daddy looked happy too. "Like the pictures we used to take when Mommy was here." Charlotte's throat tightened. She couldn't answer, couldn't trust her voice. She just held her. And in that small, tender moment, one not made of headlines or promotions or apology letters, Charlotte felt, perhaps for the first time in years, like she truly belonged, not because someone needed her, but because someone trusted her. Graham stood quietly outside the door, watching. He hadn't planned it. He'd just gone to refill his coffee when he noticed Emily wasn't at the desk where he left her. But now, as he watched his daughter resting her head on Charlotte's shoulder, he felt something settle deep inside him, like roots finally finding soil. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Later that week, Charlotte returned to her office after lunch to find a slim box sitting on her chair. Inside was a small wooden frame, and in it Emily's drawing, the same one, but now mounted carefully behind museum-grade glass. No note, no explanation, just truth, quietly honored. She ran her fingers along the edge of the frame, smiling. It didn't need a place on a pedestal, but it deserved to be seen. She hung it right above her new desk, the one in her new corner office, overlooking the city skyline and the small lake beyond the trees. A quiet reminder that before anyone else believed in her, a child already had. By month's end, word from the board became official. The press release was brief but definitive. The Whitaker Group is proud to announce the continuation of Graham Whitaker as Chief Executive Officer, with expanded leadership to support new strategic initiatives, including the New Beginnings Fund, a division led by Charlotte Hayes, focused on empowering women returning to the workforce after major life transitions. No drama, no clarifications needed. The employees didn't ask many questions, but they noticed when the frame with Emily's drawing appeared in the main conference room the next day. It wasn't pointed out, it wasn't explained, but it stayed. On the shelf behind the board table, next to industry awards and architectural models, and somehow, it made more sense there than anything else. Charlotte stood before it one afternoon after a long meeting, arms folded. "It still makes me look taller than I am," she said to Graham, who had appeared beside her. "Artistic license," he replied. They both smiled. And in that quiet, shared glance, without a touch, without a promise, there was peace. Not the kind that comes from resolution, but the kind that comes from choosing the next right thing, together. It started as a lie, but it uncovered a truth neither of them could deny. The sun filtered gently through the canopy of trees that framed the new wing of the Blue Ridge Arts Center, A year had passed, and yet the air still carried that same early autumn coolness, the same soft whisper of possibility. But this time, it was different. No paparazzi, no rumors, no accidental headlines. Just people, real ones, gathered to celebrate a program that had quietly changed more lives than any press release ever could. Charlotte stood at the podium beneath a string of delicate white lights. She wore a simple navy dress and a silver bracelet Emily had made for her at summer camp. Her voice was steady, warm, and laced with quiet conviction. "I used to believe," she began, "that starting over meant erasing what came before. But I've learned it's not about forgetting. It's about carrying the lessons with you and choosing what to leave behind." She paused, eyes scanning the audience. Women from the first year of the New Beginnings Fund sat in the front rows, some holding hands, others wiping away quiet tears, staff, friends, community leaders, and then her eyes found him. Graham, sitting a few rows back. Emily tucked neatly at his side, hand in his. He didn't wave, he didn't smile in any exaggerated way, but his eyes never left hers. Charlotte continued, "We can't always control how our stories begin, but we can decide how they unfold, and if we're lucky, how they heal." Her final words drifted into silence, the kind that means more than applause. And then the audience rose, not in a standing ovation for grandeur, but in shared reverence for a woman who had not only rebuilt her life, but helped others do the same. Later, after the speeches, the mingling, the laughter, and gentle clinking of glasses, Charlotte stepped down from the raised platform. She moved slowly through the small crowd, stopping to hug a woman who had just completed the 6-month re-entry program, to thank a donor, to hand a juice box to a fidgety toddler whose mother was speaking with the press. Then, finally, she reached him. Graham didn't move at first. He just watched her approach, the faintest trace of disbelief still in his eyes, as if a part of him hadn't yet accepted that she stayed. When she reached him, she didn't offer a handshake. She didn't lean in for another headline-making kiss. She simply opened her arms, and he stepped into them. It was a short embrace, soft, still, but it said everything the past year had written between them. When they pulled apart, Emily reached for Charlotte's hand without hesitation. Charlotte squeezed it gently, the way she always did when she needed to ground herself. They didn't pose for pictures. They didn't need to. Their family, imperfect, evolving, unlabeled, was not for show. It was for them. A few weeks later, Charlotte sat at her desk in the new corner office that overlooked the autumn trees, now turning rust and ochre. The framed drawings still hung on the wall behind her, Emily's crayon-sketched world, where the three of them stood outside the cabin. It was slightly faded now, the colors softened by sunlight. But the message was still bright. They had come a long way since that first kiss. It had started with performance, with pretending, but it had brought them face to face with truths they hadn't dared to say aloud. That grief doesn't end when you fall in love again. That love doesn't have to announce itself loudly to be real. That respect comes first. That healing takes time. And that sometimes, the most profound beginnings grow from mistakes we thought we'd never recover from. In the quiet of her office, Charlotte opened a notebook, not for minutes or meetings, but to write something for herself. She began, "Sometimes it takes a public mistake to lead us to a private truth." She underlined it once, and then closed the notebook. Satisfied, outside, the leaves fluttered like pages being turned by wind. Inside, Charlotte breathed in the silence and found it no longer empty. Life rarely unfolds the way we planned, and sometimes, what begins as a mistake, an awkward moment, a misguided choice becomes the very thing that leads us home. This story isn't just about romance. It's about dignity in the face of public shame, grace in moments of emotional chaos, and courage to choose healing over bitterness. Charlotte didn't chase love. She chose to rebuild her life with integrity and self-respect. Graham didn't force redemption. He stepped back, listened, and earned his second chance by becoming a better man, not a louder one. We are all more than our worst moments. And often, it's not the grand gestures, but the quiet, consistent acts of respect, trust, and honesty that build something lasting. So, if you've ever felt used, overlooked, or silenced, remember this. Your story isn't over, and sometimes the gentlest truths rise from the loudest mistakes. Thank you for staying with us through this heartfelt journey. If this story touched something deep in you, made you reflect, feel, or simply pause for a moment, then it's done its part. At Shining Stories, we believe in the power of quiet strength, second chances, and the beauty found in everyday moments. If you felt seen, heard, or healed in any way, please share this story with someone who might need it, and subscribe to our channel. There's always another story waiting, and we'd love for you to be part of it.